Professor at Michigan State University, and he has lived in 5 African countries for more than 25 years. Some of the positions he has held include principal economist for ICRISAT in Burkina Faso. He was also director for research at West Africa Rice. It's now called Africa Rice in Cote d'Ivoire. He was chief of global food security for UNDP in New York, and managing director for Africa for the Rockefeller Foundation when he was based in Kenya. That's when I first met him. He is beyond that, he's also served in multiple other roles in different not-for-profit organizations here in the US and in Africa. This is not surprising because he got his PhD from here at Cornell University. So it's coming back home, right? Yeah. Go Cornell. So with that, I really look forward to hearing Dr. Matlon's remarks on his perspectives on reflections on equity and international development. Over to you, Peter.
Ed, thank you very much. Can you hear me in the back? No hands go up so they can't hear me. Yes, okay, thank you. Ed, thank you so very, very much for the introduction. Eli? How do we advance? It's not going. They always work a second ago. Sorry, where should I press it? Point it over here?
You can just use this. I hadn't engaged the.
Okay. Good, I've just turned it off. All right. Again, thanks for the introduction. These sets of power of points here basically summarize the arc of my career. Before I talk through some of them, what I'd like to do is say a few words about why I got into development in the first place, what drew me into this work, and then how did I prepare for it. I was a very impressionable high school student in the 1960s when there was a young president by the name of John Kennedy, who inspired me and many in my generation basically to pursue a career in service, national service or international service. It was John F. Kennedy that established the Peace Corps. He established USAID, and many of us were basically captured by a vision of doing something meaningful in the world. So following that, I went to Georgetown University, the School of Foreign Service, not knowing what aspect of international work I would pursue. And while there, I had the opportunity to do a summer in Uganda between my junior and senior year, very much similar to the SMART program. And I was totally smitten. I was really captured by what I saw, what we did, what I felt while I was there. And that changed my career direction. And I decided, well, let's go into international development. So I went on to the Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School, it was then called the Woodrow Wilson School, to do a terminal master's degree in public affairs. And while I was there, I studied under an economist by the name of Sir Arthur Lewis, who subsequently received a Nobel Prize in economics for his work in development theory. I took my first course with him, my second course with him, and essential to his theory of economic development was that you had to get agriculture going first. It would free up labor, keep wages low, free up food to keep prices low. Industry could take off. So then I decided, well, I can't stop with a master's degree in public affairs. I didn't have any tools. How do I work in agriculture without tools? So I came to Cornell initially to get another master's degree, and then I discovered that 2 masters is worse than 1 because they think you failed twice to go on to your PhD program. So I went on and stayed here and did a PhD program, which afforded me an opportunity to do a deep immersion in Africa, in northern Nigeria, but I'll come back to that. So that preparation then got me ready to do this work. I did what, as Ed mentioned, lived and worked in 6 African countries, a couple of years in India. Focus started on agricultural development, and then it expanded over time. Worked with, as Ed said, ICRISAT in Burkina Faso, and then with Africa Rice in Côte d'Ivoire. And I worked at multiple levels: economist, research director, and then I was a board chair of one of the centers. I then went on to UN Development Program. For family reasons, I finally left after 20 years in Africa and came back to New York City, where I headed up the Global Food Security and Agriculture Program in New York. And then I got an offer from the Rockefeller Foundation to go back to Africa, which I was anxious to do, and head up the Africa program, which was based in Nairobi, Kenya. So you can see from the positions I held that I was both a doer, I did research, and I was a donor at the end of my career. And both of those perspectives give you different insights as to how the whole machinery of the development industry operates. I had tremendously rewarding experiences. On the personal side, I worked under and with some truly gifted African professionals, many of whom I still have a very close, lifelong friendship with. On the professional side, I was able to contribute to the development of a number of life-changing technologies, both in Burkina Faso as well as in Côte d'Ivoire. Able to contribute to the training of dozens of young African scientists and researchers. And I was able to contribute to the building of a number of new institutions that exist still today. I was able to design and help fund the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, and I was the first president of that group. Was able to design and fund the African Agricultural Technology Foundation, which transfers intellectual property from the private sector to the public sector for agricultural development. I was part of the designing of Agora, together with librarian at Man Library here, the access to global online resources for Africa, and then was able to basically help design and again lead as board chair award the African Women in Agricultural Research and Development. Extremely rewarding experiences. Over the arc of my career, however, in the different contexts that I worked in the different positions that I occupied, there were constant red flags. Something didn't make sense here. Something wasn't working here, either in terms of the organization that I was working with, of the landscape of partners that I was working with, or with my colleagues. At first, some of these red flags came as a surprise, and then a disappointment when I realized that this wasn't all that I had signed up for. This isn't why I went into development. And finally, my initial idealism, following on John Kennedy, turned to disillusionment in many ways. And I've been reflecting over the years on what was it that I experienced that wasn't right. And I've come to a number of conclusions. It's still a work in process. First, I want to underline that there is no question that the development industry has produced many, many results. I'm still proud to have worked in international development, but I'm more aware now of a number of systematic flaws and challenges at several levels in the development industry, at the ecosystem level, at the organizational or institutional level, and at the personal level. And these have compromised the achievement of the full benefits that could have been accomplished with the investment that has been put into development. And what I've concluded is that if one wants to pursue a successful career, successful in the sense of both having lasting impact and maintaining your values of what brought you into development in the first place, you have to be aware of what these flaws are, what these systemic challenges are, and you need to put in place certain coping behaviors to be able to be successful within the context of very flawed systems. Now, in a sense, the systemic flaws at each of these three levels, the landscape, the organizational, personal, derive in part from the origin story of development. There are two, I think, historical markers that I would want to point to where development started. The first is with colonialism. The first investments in infrastructure, in education, in health, made under the colonial powers. And these were often explicitly white supremacist powers, and the work was done in a white supremacist mindset. There was an exploitive relationship that was developed between the colonial power and the colony. Very often there was the imposition of cultural values and explicit attempts to erase traditional values and societal structures, to replace them with the mother country's values. We see that both in Britain and particularly with the French colonies. The second historical marker was the Cold War. This is started in the 50s, went on through the early 90s, when the West was basically in a global struggle with the Soviet Union. And aid was one way of securing allies, to get them to vote appropriately in the UN, to be able to put US bases in given locations, and to establish trading relationships that would exclude the Soviet bloc. Now, these transactional relationships and the attempt to secure allies was very explicit in the foundational documents of in the US foreign assistance. It's explicit in the USAID in 1961, in the Point 4 program of 1948, and it was explicit in the Marshall Plan. That is why we invested in the Marshall Plan. The point I want to drive home is that this is not only history. The DNA of both the colonial mindset and the transactional relationships in our USAID programs, for example, are very much built in to the DNA. That DNA is built into the mindsets, the approaches of development agencies even today. Now, in addition to the origin story, the problems of the origin story, I think we have to recognize some of the risks that are inherent in the development construct, if you will. The first of those is that economic development, particularly neoliberal economic development, requires societal transformation. It requires that traditions be lost, societies be disrupted, and replaced by something that a donor or the donor agency is trying to replace it with. So a development agency goes in and disrupts societies that it doesn't fully understand and in which it really has no stake. The second moral risk is the fact that the relationships between donors and recipients comes in very deep power asymmetries, power imbalances. It is the donor that calls the tune. It's the recipient that has to comply in most instances. Who makes the decisions? So you have problems of dependency, of agency, the lack of agency, the disempowering of recipient countries that is we see in most development programs over the decades. And the problem here is that there is no institution, no social contract that holds development agencies accountable for what they do. Now, a different set of challenges occur at the organizational or institutional level. Listed here some of the major agencies that are active in development, from bilateral agencies through research centers, through religious and secular NGOs, and the Beltway bandits in Washington, the for-profit technical assistance companies. The point I want to make here is that doing good for the most beneficiaries is not always, or even most of the time, the priority operationally in terms of how they operate. Take, for example, bilateral development agencies. Take, for example, USAID or DFID in the UK. We have to recognize that aid, technical assistance, foreign assistance, financial assistance, is simply one tool in the foreign policy toolbox. The realpolitik priority of foreign policy is to advance the geopolitical and economic interests of the donor country. As such, the priorities that a recipient country would have are very often ignored and agenda imposed on recipient countries. Very often conditions are imposed, such as procurement policies, which reduce the benefit of the aid that is provided. That is, the money has to be spent in the donor country, as opposed to generating backward and frontward linkages in the recipient country to get more bang for the buck. Most ODA is, USAID is a good example, has short-term appropriations, very often one-year appropriations, and they need to demonstrate impact in a very short-term frame to keep the legislator funding the aid program. As such, very rarely are root causes being addressed. Generally, short-term, low-hanging fruit are being addressed, which doesn't bring about the transformation that's necessary. And most of all, this kind of aid systematically disempowers recipients. It creates dependencies such that the politicians of a recipient country are often much more accountable to a donor than they are to their own constituents. So it undercuts democracy. A different set of problems with the incentive structure is linked to the private sector and research and NGO and nonprofit organizations. Here, the development goals are often compromised by the need to advance organizational interests. What are the organizational interests of an NGO? It's to mobilize funding. It's to promote its brand. It's to grow market share. And in doing that, very often they have a monitoring and evaluation system or a monitoring system which generates good stories, and trumps learning. Instead of trying to learn what is working, what isn't working, and adjusting, they collect information to basically put into glossies and 3-minute commercials to generate funding. And I know, having worked in research centers where I've been on the board and in management, we talk much more about getting that next contract than we do about evaluating how effectively our work is being done and what impact we're having. The incentive structure, this dysfunctional incentive structure at the organization level, also leads to a very fractured landscape. The development landscape is cluttered with turf battles. That is, organizations that are working in closely related areas that should be natural partners, but who actually compete. They compete for attention, they compete for funding in a mindset of a zero-sum game competition. And they're competing for that next contract, for the funding which is coming from similar sources. I've seen this repeatedly in the CGIAR, the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research, some 18 centers around the world that do ag research. We've had, within the CGIAR, wars, what we call the maize wars, between CIMMYT in Mexico and IITA in Nigeria, where they would not share germplasm, they would not share technological advances, and they were competing with the same donor for funding. We see it in the cassava wars, the CIAT and IITA, the same pattern. And I was myself involved in the rice wars when Africa Rice was competing with Erie in the Philippines. We were in Cote d'Ivoire, and we were fighting with the same donors for funding. So it was not pretty. We could have done our work better if we had worked together, but the incentive structure isn't built to do that. Another example was with the UN agencies. When I was with UNDP, I was the executive secretary of the interagency working group of FIVMs that was bringing together the UN agencies that worked on food insecurity information systems. Each of these agencies, the World Bank, UNICEF, WFP, and a number of NGOs were working, supporting national countries, developing food security monitoring systems so that we would have early warning systems to alert when famine was approaching. And we decided to bring them together and try to get them to work together, to stop competing for the attention of host countries and share technologies and harmonize them to make it less confusing, less costly, more efficient. We could get the technicians agreeing on what needed to be done. We could never get the heads of the administrations of these agencies to agree to work together. So we kept going with a very ineffective competitive system, which burdened low-income countries and didn't bring forward the most efficient, timely information on food insecurity. The same thing happens with disciplinary silos. We're all trained. Somebody's trained as a breeder, a nematologist, an agronomist, an economist. And basically, when we go to the field, we very often do what we know how to do. And we think of our discipline as central to moving the boulder to make a real impact. But if those disciplines are not able to work together in a way that they can fill each other's gaps and complement each other's knowledge in the designing of interventions, you're not going to make the impact that we need to have. While there's a lot of talk on multi-agency and multidisciplinary cooperation, very rarely is it effective in practice in the field. Finally, we got problems at the individual level. Let me start out by saying many, perhaps even most people who are working in development that I have certainly worked with are in development for the right reasons. They are trying to do their jobs well, improve people's well-being and lives. But there are also many, more than you would want to admit, that are quote unquote doing development because of the perks, the power that they can exercise, and the privileges that they have. Most people who are working in development are actually living far better when they're overseas than they could ever live when they're back in their home countries. The hardship allowances, subsidized housing, and so forth makes it very attractive for a person who's not committed to a development mission to pursue that type of career. And the problem is that the attitudes and the behaviors, the mindsets of those people can be very toxic and counterproductive. People who are not there for the mission, but they're only to draw a high salary, I've observed are very often denigrating of local populations. They are condescending and patronizing, and it's very difficult to work with people of that type. When I arrived in Burkina Faso in the early 80s, this was a joke that was going around. The Ouagadougou at that time was a fascinating place with development experts from all over the world. It was a real menagerie of interesting people, many of whom would feel very much at home in a Graham Greene novel or in a poem by Kipling. And we said that there were basically three types of people who were expatriates doing development in West Africa: the madmen, the missionaries, and the mercenaries. The madmen were people who were basically looking for adventure. They were very often misfits in the U.S., but they fit very, very well in Burkina Faso. Your missionaries, two sides of that coin. Some that were actually there to do good work, do good Samaritan work. On the flip side, they were there to convert people, carrying the white man's burden in a civilizing mission. The mercenaries were there because they were drawing a better salary, better pension than they could being an insurance salesman back in the U.S. The trouble is that when you're working with people with these kinds of mixed motivations, it leads to very mixed behaviors, and it's difficult to stay on the same page and row in the same direction. So these are some of the problems that I observed over the different contexts over the arc of my career, and trying to learn how I could work effectively, retain my values, be successful in development work, facing that very flawed context at the ecosystem, organizational, and personal level. And I was able to observe people who were able to succeed at that, who were very successful in maintaining their values and working for the mission that they were there on. And what I've distilled from my experience in observing others are basically 6 lessons that I would like to go through very quickly with you. The first is, when one goes to the field, if one is an expat working in a emerging market country, be humble. You might be coming out of the best university in the world. You may be coming from the best agricultural college in the world, but there is so much that you don't know. You don't have all the answers, and in fact, very, very often in any given context, you are not even asking the right questions. Many of the tools that you learn in class are useful theoretically, but they have to be adapted and fine-tuned in any given context. And many of them don't fit at all. There's so much more that you have to learn, and you can learn from anybody, just about everybody in that new context. Certainly learn from your partners, local partners. Learn from everybody on the street. You can learn from a taxi driver as you're driving around if you just maintain a conversation with them to understand the political environment that you're in. But one thing I really learned, and it came home to me time and time again, is that while we are flying in, or we might be there for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, and we consider ourselves the experts that have been brought in, the local partners are often far more expert than we are. Increasingly, they have the same level of education that you do, and they know where they are. They know the institutions, the cultural dimensions of what's needed to actually bring about transformation. So the key there is be humble, empower your local partners. Cultivate a sense of empathy. And by empathy, of course, we don't mean sympathy, we mean empathy. It's seeing the world through somebody else's eyes, walking in their shoes. And it's necessary at a number of levels. With political leaders, policymakers, understand what makes them tick. What are they trying to achieve? What does the politician need to do for his constituency to stay in power? So you understand what's driving the political leader. Understand the challenges that your local partners are facing, so that you don't put more of a burden on them than they are able to do given the limits of their resources. Most of all, try to be empathetic with the clients that you're working with. For example, in the case of farmers, how do they see their farming system? What are the real goals that they're trying to achieve? What are the objectives? How do they perceive their major risks? What are the real constraints that they're facing? That's true empathy. How do you develop empathy? The best is total immersion. I was very, very fortunate with funding that Cornell provided me when I did my thesis work in northern Nigeria. I was able to live in a Hausa village for 15 months. I learned Hausa so I could conduct interviews. No running water, no electricity, and this was a town of about 60 households, and there were no tin roofs in that village. My 15 months in that town called Zosa gave me a lens, a sensitivity that I have used for the rest of my career. An essential lens to be able to try to see through the eyes of other people. What are the challenges they're facing, the deaths in their family and so forth. I buried a couple of the farmers that I was actually doing survey work. I was never part of their families, but I was as close as I could possibly have been for that 15-month period. Why not closer? Because they knew I could leave and that I would leave at the end. That's a limitation. Any intervention that you do or any quantitative survey work you do, start it off with qualitative, deep qualitative research. If you are doing research in terms of technology development, it has to be participatory. Short feedback loops from farmers when you're doing this type of work on farm. Do your homework. You would not believe how many expats are in a country for years and have never read any of the historical or economic background to the country, that don't read local newspapers. One of the things that I found extremely useful was to read novels written by local authors, which gives you an empathetic lens into trying to understand somewhat better the population. And avoid living in a bubble. Avoid living in a bubble. Deep engagement in local economy. Now, the lack of humility and empathy I've seen as a farming systems economist has contributed to poor performance of development assistance to African agriculture. And perhaps afterwards I can explain in the ways that how that has contributed. But there were years and years of transferring technologies from Asia into Africa that made absolutely no sense to African farmers. And it was very difficult to stop that transfer. The lack of empathy and humility also contributes to a lot of unsuccessful, or at least unvaluable economic research projects. If the researcher does not understand the intra and inter-household power relationships and decision-making systems, the models are going to be poorly specified. Their operationalization of variables will be poor and really won't make any sense. Learn how to adapt. Nothing ever goes as planned. That I've learned over and over and over again, either because you didn't have sufficient information up front to plan the intervention, because your assumptions were wrong, or you had the wrong theory of change, possibly due to training that you might have received in a classroom. Implementation is weak, or there are external shocks. When it doesn't work out, don't get frustrated, don't get angry, don't blame anybody, blame yourself, and then learn. And put in place adaptive management, where one has a very tight feedback loop, where you are monitoring what is happening and you're learning and adjusting as you go along. And look for new opportunities. If we have time afterward, I could tell you how one program was put into Burkina Faso as a forestry project. It was a complete failure, but what they learned from there shifted into a water surface runoff management project, and it was the most successful technology in Burkina Faso. One project failed, but from that they learned what actually farmers wanted and needed. So most projects don't lock themselves into the original plan, they evolve. Problem with adaptation is that you need a monitoring and evaluation system to feed it with the information to tell you how to adapt what you're doing. And the problem with most monitoring and evaluation systems and impact assessment work that's being done in many organizations is that it has been co-opted not for a learning function, but to generate good stories, generate the information that will go into marketing, PR, and generating the next grant, basically. And again, I'd love to come back and describe a couple of incidences where this has occurred repeatedly in the CGIAR. It occurs a lot in UN agencies. Deploy team approaches. I don't think we have to say much here. Development work is never silver bullet. It is always complex, multiple disciplines, and a time frame that's necessary for disciplines to come together, feed on each other, develop insights into systems that then together bring about a transformation. While you're still a student here, what I would strongly recommend is take as many classes outside of your major, your focus, that are at the periphery, so that you're able to at least understand the vocabulary of key disciplines that you'll need to work with to be effective. And so that you're able to actually generate support from other colleagues. And when you don't have the colleagues within your team, bring in partners. Arm yourself with moral courage. So what do you do when you face the challenges that I have described? The neo-colonial attitudes, the self-serving organizations that are employing you, the patronizing, condescending, and disrespectful attitudes of colleagues. What do you do when you face that? And if you're working in the field, I guarantee you, you will encounter this more often than you would wish to. I would say is stand up, speak out, challenge, and correct. Try to challenge your organizations from within to try to bring about change, but don't be quiet. When you see something that isn't being done right, stand up, challenge it, mobilize your evidence, mobilize your arguments, find allies within your organization, and try to bring about change from within. It's just on honest evaluation, going back to a point I made earlier. When you hear patronizing, condescending, possibly outright racist language, call it out. Make sure that they know this is not acceptable in my team. And when it's absolutely necessary, don't be afraid of a principal resignation. But make sure that if you do resign from an organization, it's public and that the reasons for your resigning are clearly known, because this will help give other people more leverage to bring about the change that perhaps you were not able to. Final point, what I have found in the course of my career is far and away the most satisfying work that I did that had the most grounded and lasting effect was contributing to the capacities of the country that I was working with. At the person level, this could be formal training. It could be informal coaching, mentoring, sponsoring, and something that's too often overlooked, empowering them through delegation. Give more responsibility to the host country nationals that you're working with. Let them mature in terms of their skills, their confidence, so that they can take on more of the responsibility and, frankly, replace you. At the institutional level, it means not allowing international organizations to disempower, crowd out national and regional organizations, a pattern that we see all over the continent. And where it's necessary, as I was able to do with AGRO, with AATF, with AWARD, help establish new organizations under local leadership that will continue over the years. Working yourself out of a job may be your most important contribution when you're working in development. When I started working in development in the 70s, 80s, one could perhaps make an argument that I was filling a gap, that there was some need for the skills and experience that I brought, Cornell, Ph.D., and so forth. That's not so true anymore today. You've got layers of extremely well-trained local experts, and your presence there could sometimes crowd them out, compete with them. So work yourself out of a job. Empower them, give them responsibility, step up, and then get out of the way. But let me stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm sure we have some questions. If you can just be as brief as possible with your question, introduce yourself and ask a question.
Hello, my name is Rifki. I'm from Indonesia, and I'm working for development for 2 years and then working for ministry for 4 years. My question is like, what is your view about the decolonize of international development? And in the same time, the increasing role of the non-Western international development institution? And then the second one is that also you said that this functional incentive structure is competing for funding, but in the same time, the competition should be resulting in the best program that becoming the program that they're funding. So competition have still a role to make sure that we have the best program that exists in access in the funding. So what do you think? But
Let me answer the second question first, then I'd like you to repeat the first question. But if you've got two organizations, both of which are doing identical work in the same locale, competition can be very good. If though they are potential partners where they could complement, where the sum of the parts is greater, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, then the competition is unhealthy because they undercut each other. They will very often deliberately try to sabotage the work of the others. I have seen that in the CGIAR system. And that kind of competition is not healthy. But where there are natural partners where they could share germplasm, share lessons learned, they need to work together. They shouldn't be competing. Now, the first question again.
how about the idea of decolonized international development? Decolonize.
Yes.
Yeah, and then in the same time, how do you think about the increasing role of the non-Western international development institutions? Because
Absolutely wonderful questions. That's basically what I was trying to say, that we need to decolonize the agencies that are working today. And frankly, the extent to which they can be replaced, Northern agencies can be replaced by agencies from the South and banks and development banks from the South. Absolutely. That should be the future. That should be where we should be aiming.
More questions? Yes.
Hi, Jonathan Latham. I wondered, did you ever consider resigning or actually resign from a position, in the way that you described?
Yes, and I did. Yes. I can't name names, but yes, I disagreed strongly with some policies in one of the research institutions that I was working in. All right, I'll get into it. So when I was a farming systems economist with ICRISAT in Burkina Faso, my work was to work on farm with a team of, I had 9 technical scientists, breeders, agronomists, and so forth. And I would take their best materials to the farm and have it tested through a participatory research approach by farmers. Did this for 6 years. The results every year was the same. Farmers did not want the materials that were being provided to them by the breeders, and they told us why. Wrong plant type, wrong duration, photoperiod insensitive, tasted like. Okay, so for 5 years, 6 years, I brought those back and reported every year in the annual meeting of ICRISAT. And the administration did not put any pressure on the breeders to think seriously about what are we learning from the farmers. And so they kept sending out the same lousy material. And I frankly, at that point, gave up. I had a lot of publications demonstrating these peer-reviewed, and it had no impact. I resigned from there, took up a job as director of research at another CG center, where I was able to put in place a system which actually incorporated participatory research from the get-go to define what farmers wanted up front, and then to trace the development of materials over generations, so that we finally came out with a product which was precisely what farmers wanted within their farming system. And within 6 years, we won the World Food Prize because of that work that was done. Developing the Nurikas in Africa rice.
We'll take
Yeah,
one
okay.
question from the online audience. Eli, I'll let you.
Yeah, we have a question from Jonathan Sagan online who asks, what do you think are the best measures for local capacity building? Says his lab uses a number of persons trained, for instance, which sometimes seems to inflate the capacity building and other times doesn't capture informal capacity building or word of mouth transfer. So what do you think the best measures are?
Well, a measure I wouldn't use is just counting output heads that are being trained. That's not useful. That's just an output. That's not an outcome. What we're looking for are outcomes and impacts. So the outcomes would be the skills that people have that they are bringing into their jobs, the confidence that they have built up, their own advancement in their own system, and then the impacts would be the development impacts that those young people have once they're back on the ground. But a head count, just a body count of people coming out of training programs is not very useful.
Unfortunately, we're out of our time now, and I ask you to give a round of applause to our speaker. Thank you very much.